ICAMT, the International Committee of Architecture and Museums Techniques, decided to gather short but significant stories about design of nowadays museum. In a time of uncertainties marked by the pandemic and by transition towards sustainability, digitalization and wars. The stories of architects, designers, museum experts and directors mark the transition of museum institutions which have chosen to become leaders of the changes of our time for democratization, inclusivity and accessibility to visual and material culture. Podcast goal is to reach this event with themes, examples and solutions that might become better daily approaches. Welcome to the ICAMT podcast series. I am Maddalena D'Alfonso of the board of ICAMT, the International Committee for Architecture and Museum Techniques of ICOM, the International Council of Museums. Good morning, Amareswar. Thank you for being here with us on the ICAMT podcast.
Well, first of all, thanks to ICAMT for inviting me to the podcast, especially to the president, Nana, who wrote to me inviting me, and Maddalena, who gave a briefing, and thank you for your kind words.
Amareswar Galla is UNESCO Chair on Inclusive Museum and Sustainable Heritage Development, an alumnus of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi with a PhD from the Australian National University of Canberra. Currently is Professor of Inclusive Cultural Leadership and Founding Director of the International Center for Inclusive Cultural Leadership at the Anand National University in Ahmedabad, India. Founding Executive Director of the International Institute for the Inclusive Museum in Australia, India and USA, formerly full professor of World Heritage and Sustainable Development at the University of Split, located in the World Heritage City of Split. First full professor of Museum Studies in Australia at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, and prior to that, full professor and director of Sustainable Heritage Development Programs at the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies in Australia at the National University of Canberra. His extensive publication record includes the flagship project and publication World Heritage Benefits Beyond Borders of the Cambridge University Press and AMP, made by UNESCO for the 40th anniversary of the 1972 UNESCO World Heritage Convention, launched in Kyoto, Japan in 2012. Your work on decolonization is outstanding. Which roles can have museum in the reduction of inequalities and in generating new narratives?
Decolonization is still largely addressed within a colonial paradigm. In many cases, colluding partners tango together. The boundary of the host museum, mostly in the former metropolitan colonial centers, and the capital cities of the former colonies often come together in a shared power structure of elite male classes. It precludes genuine intellectual and professional progression. Some disruptive elements are part of the current process of return and restitution of the Benin bronzes. At two ends of the spectrum are the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, that is progressive and respectful, and on the other hand is the British Museum, that is conservative and frozen in time in a colonial past. As a result, decolonization has largely remained a site of resistance rather than one of transformation, leading to post-coloniality. Museums could be agents of change in strategic partnerships that are founded on mutual respect and shared vision. However, it requires decolonization, not just from the global north control, but situating the voices, integrity, and cultural justice from the global south, positioning the primary stakeholders of the heritage collections that we are discussing about.
Australia is one of the nations most sensible to the multiculturalism. How can multiculturalism be expressed in museums to achieve the establishment of a sentiment of community?
Australia, like Canada, USA, New Zealand, is part of the invading settler societies where the colonial Caucasian populations have become numeral majority, reducing the indigenous populations to a minority. In recent decades, and indeed from the 19th century in a small way, non-Anglophone immigration has contributed to cultural pluralism in these countries. There are different paradigms. Canada has legal framework enabling its multiculturalism and treaties with First Nations, while Australia has an agenda for multiculturalism only and no treaty with its indigenous populations. New Zealand anchors on the Treaty of Waitangi and the USA on its constitutional framework and several treaties with Native Americans. Multiculturalism in other parts of the world has different formations. For example, both India and South Africa have constitutional mandates for their multiculturalism embedded in fundamental rights. Museums indeed have been addressing multiculturalism in different ways in the recent past, but predominantly from an exhibitory framework or complex of us and them, or self and the other. As a migrant some 4 decades ago, I provided leadership in Australia through policy-based approaches. My education in India provided the anchor, as India has pursued legal affirmative action from the 1950s. In Australia, White Australia policy ended in the 1970s, and the decolonization of the cultural institutions took much longer, and it's still an ongoing process. I was in the leadership position in this process as both national and the local Australian capital territory levels. Similarly, I provided leadership at the international level through ICOM as its vice president, president of ICOM Asia Pacific Alliance, and chair of the ICOM Cross Cultural Task Force. In all my experience, I firmly believe, based on informed knowledge, that only when museums reflect in their total corporate culture and personnel the cultural and linguistic diversity of their primary stakeholder populations, that they will resonate with the local communities and buy in their ownership and support. This is clearly reflected in the ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter adopted by the 25th General Assembly of ICOM in Shanghai in 2010. And I think that in many ways, ICOM has some excellent historical documents and its own code of ethics, but there's a certain amount of cultural amnesia within the organization. And I think that people need to go back into the history of ICOM and see where we have come from in addressing cultural pluralism, cultural rights over the last few decades. I think the history of ICOM is very extremely rich, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
The Inclusive Museum Research Network, held by you, is brought together by a shared concern for the future role of the museum and how it can become more inclusive. Can you tell us how this organization will contribute to museum and exhibitions?
Inclusion has become an integral part of the popular parlance for transformations and furthering active citizenship across the world. And the Inclusive Museum Research Network is at the positions museums at the forefront as agents of change, agencies of change. The building of this inclusive museum knowledge community has been consultative and incremental since its foundation in Leiden in 2008. The annual Research Network conference profiles leading thinkers in the cultural domains and provides a platform for young, emerging, and established scholars and professionals. What has been problematized since the beginning is the conceptualization of the community itself. It is at once culturally and linguistically diverse. wherever you talk of a community. The dialectical process of decolonization and contextualization through the first voice of primary stakeholders has been underlined by the Inclusive Museum Research Network. In this agenda, cultural, social, economic, and environmental sustainability is on the canvas of holistic approaches to addressing all forms of museums and heritage phenomena in their multiplicity of formation manifestations. Across access for all and ethical engagement of all museological considerations have become central. This contribution was a very clear outcome of the Inclusive Museum Research Network Conference in Philadelphia in 2022, where Dr. Lonnie Bunch, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, opened with a conversation arguing that museums are no longer community-centered, but museums must be community-based, must be in the center of the communities. And I think that's a fundamental paradigm shift that's needed. Historically, in terms of exhibitions, there have been some wonderful exhibitions. I once again refer to the Tropen Museum, one of my learning institutions, the exhibition called Black on White in 1989, and more recently, about a decade ago, Urban Islam, some of the groundbreaking exhibitions. And I think that what we do through our annual conferences, we get speakers who are curators, facilitators, directors of such seminal exhibitions to present in the annual Research Network Conference, and their papers are published in the International Journal for the Inclusive Museum. So that's how we provide an open-ended process for the progress of the discourse of inclusion. Thank you.
You work a lot on the topic of diversity and inclusivity. Can you tell us about your approach to accessibility?
You know, diversity and inclusivity have become popular words used by everyone these days, but very few people understand the depth and integrity of such significant cultural frameworks. And I've often argued that inclusion and all forms of access are of ethical concern for museums. In fact, in the ICOM General Conference in 2016 in Milan, one of my articles was launched as part of the ethics volume edited by Dr. Bernice Murphy and launched during the General Assembly on ethics, museums and ethics. And it was in search of the inclusive museum. There's no one size fits all. And but unfortunately, in the way people address inclusion, the deficit model continues. It's like us in museums saving them kind of paternalistic mentality is still there. It's not affirmative and acknowledging of the richness of diversity. And that's where the International Research Network on the Inclusive Museum promotes continuous engagement, arguing for genuine inclusion and for all of us, not us and them. There's always some local trigger and focus when a new movement is born. Doesn't matter where it is. In the case of the Inclusive Museum Research Network, it was a response to the aftermath in 2004 of the brutal and silencing murder of the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh outside the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, and a subsequent conference entitled Dancing with Diversity, which was held at the same museum. This movement shaped a call for museums to move beyond benevolent multiculturalism and to grasp that decolonization needed much more than tolerance of difference. Only activism and determined reforms could accomplish needed changes worldwide. Born of this movement in 2004, inclusion is now an ongoing change program without boundaries. In its continuing forms, it's led today by an international board of eminent museum directors that guide the International Research Network on the Inclusive Museum. I, born in India, but spent 4 decades as an Australian citizen with extensive global experience in cultural diversity program, act as the chair of the research network, And we meet in different parts of the world. We try to, engage with all social groups. And so the approach is one of intergenerational dialogue, cross-cultural engagement, and ethics of all forms of engagement. Thank you.
Your publication, World Heritage Benefits Beyond Borders, about the promotion of integrated planning for all forms of heritage. How museum institution can contribute to the future preservation and sharing of world heritage?
Wow, thank you for that question. It's a publication by Cambridge University Press and UNESCO Publishing, launched in Kyoto, Japan, in 2012 November. And why it is a turning point publication is that in 2011, I did a desk audit of World Heritage premier publications and found that over 90% of publications come from 7 Western countries. And while we have World Heritage sites from over 190 countries. And so who is controlling the discourse? So what we did was, through an extensive consultative process, we wanted to promote integrated planning between all forms of heritage with local communities. And that's why it's called World Heritage Benefits Beyond Borders. Who actually benefits from World Heritage? And so we argued for a benefit analysis, and we argued for cultural economics. We argued that culture is not frozen in time in terms of authenticity, integrity, but that it's complementing that tangible with the intangible, that of living cultures and living heritage. If you look at World Heritage sites, majority of them have got living populations either within them or around them. So what does World Heritage mean when we take a fusion of both the outstanding universal value and the significance of local cultural values? How do we reconcile the two? How do we ensure that inscription on the World Heritage List is not decontextualization, but an affirmation of the local populations willing to share their heritage with the rest of the world? I think it's a very positive approach. And museums have a very significant role to play. There are more than 1,100 World Heritage sites, and there are more than 9,000 museums in these World Heritage sites. If not all of them, but most of them. If you take the case of a place like Robben Island Museum, it's the World Heritage site. If you go to China, you go to Xi'an, and Entombed Warriors, we all know about it, but the Xi'an World Heritage Site is basically 3 museums. In Europe, there are many cathedrals, many churches, like Roskilde in Denmark. It's a living museum that's still being used. And so my argument has been, when I was the vice president of ICOM, that ICOM should provide leadership in addressing museums and their specific role, how they provide for preservation, conservation, safeguarding, diverse heritage as part of sharing of world heritage. I've argued for it. However, it still needs to be taken up, because the World Heritage Convention limits the advisory role to ICAMOS, International Council for Monuments and Sites, and World Conservation Union, and ICRAM. And so based on a very Western nature culture binary, very site-centered. And so members of ICAMOS have argued that museums are interpretation centers. That is not true at all. You only got to look at the latest definition of ICOM, or even the older definition of 2007. Museums are far more than interpretation centers. They're keepers of diverse movable heritage that's within the World Heritage context. And that discussion is yet to take place. And I hope that ICOM and ICOMOS would collaborate to do this, not in isolation, but together. and that UNESCO with the 2015 museum recommendation would play a role in bringing them together.
You are currently Professor of Inclusive Cultural Leadership and Founding Director of the International Center for Inclusive Cultural Leadership. Can you tell us more about this type of assignment, on what principle it is based? How this thematic arrives to your interests and passionate you?
Well, it's very much about leadership. Leadership can be resonant leadership, it could be inspirational leadership. I believe in inclusion is possible through inspirational leadership. And this center focuses on ICOM and its definition, ICAMOS and its code of ethics, ICOM and its code of ethics, 2015 recommendation of UNESCO on museums and collections, and all the 6 suite of cultural conventions of UNESCO, trying to bring together new forms of pedagogy and curricular development, international networking research conferences like the International Research Conference on the Inclusive Museum, but also partnerships. Partnerships are really critical so that we don't work in isolation, but we work together because we want to promote a better world for the future generations. And so leadership is critical, inspirational leadership. So that's what the main purpose of my position.
How do you think museum can better improve the 4 pillars of UNESCO: cultural, economic, social, and environmental sustainability for the implementation of the UN Sustainable Goals and the Agenda 2030?
Well, one has to go to the archaeology of UN Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. It starts with the Brundtland Commission and 1989, and then 1992, the Rio World Earth Summit, where a large number of indigenous people came together, and I said environmental sustainability is only possible when it's grounded in indigenous knowledge systems and the diversity of cultural systems. It's taken a long time, and then by 2002, the Rio Plus 10 it's called the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development, took place. The argument from African countries, Asia Pacific countries, and Latin America was very strongly that there's still the boundary of nature and culture. In Africa, Asia Pacific, there is no dichotomy of nature and culture. It's a colonial paradigm that we need to take a sustainable development. And that's also when the UNESCO Cultural Diversity Charter was launched in Johannesburg in 2002. And the Cultural Diversity Charter is from 2001, but its action plan was launched in Johannesburg, my correction place. And by 2012, when the Rio Plus 20 meeting took place, it was very much disappointment of the lack of delivery of Millennium Development Goals. And Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General of UN, famously said, more of the same will not do. That means we need new approaches. The previous Millennium Development Goals focused on the global north saving the global south kind of mentality. That was given away. Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2020, 2030 is all of us, global north, global south, all of us together. Like, for instance, if you take a country like Sweden, which has been very generous in its support for MDGs and also SDGs, it also has to address SDGs within Swedish territory itself. So all the countries of the global north not only address globally the sustainable development goals through Agenda 2030, but they also address them within their own countries. And that is where the major shift is. But the challenge has been that many people in museums and cultural institutions heritage bodies have looked at SDG 11 in terms of urbanism, in terms of culture, but all the 17 SDGs need to address culture. Only then Agenda 2030 can be realized. And the best example that I can give is ICOM Austria. In Vienna, ICOM Austria initiated a project 4 years ago, 17 museums and 17 SDGs. And they piloted all the 17 SDGs on how museums could actually facilitate. And I think that's the kind of approach that would help. And the UNESCO pillars, cultural, economic, social, environmental sustainability, if you actually Google or if you search for the website onsustainability.com, on sustainability.com, or onsustainability, one word.com, you'll come across a huge knowledge club community that started with the Johannesburg Summit and continues. And it has a major international research journal which argues for the 4 pillars of sustainability. This is sponsored, supported from Urbana Champaign by the Common Ground Research Networks, and that has informed the discourse of all the UN organizations on taking the 4 pillars approach. And I think we need to understand fundamentally that culture, economic, social, and environmental sustainability are not 4 separate pillars, but they're collaborative agencies that come together if we want to deliver sustainable development goals. We only have another 7 years left before Agenda 2030. Progress is fairly mixed across the world because we also have to integrate climate crisis. We have to integrate Black Lives Matter. We have to integrate post-pandemic realities. So when you triangulate Black Lives Matter, climate crisis, post-pandemic realities, when you triangulate them, the sustainable development goals become even more challenging to address and achieve. But the challenge is we need to, because we don't want anybody left behind, with the SDG 1 that focuses on alleviating everyone from poverty and providing dignity and self-respect and a sense of place and identity for everyone. And this is very much within the UNESCO Charter, its foundational charter. So it's really important that all intergovernmental agencies, all non-governmental agencies, all the governments work together if sustainable development goals are going to be achieved. And in this context, as I quoted, museums can play a very important role, and ICOM Austria from Vienna has provided a significant model. And based on this, International Museum Research Network, Inclusive Museum Research Network, and ICOM Austria are hosting next year in September, that's 2024, a major international conference in Vienna to showcase case studies and to show how we could all learn and from ICOM Austria and how the 4 pillars of sustainability could be addressed and SDGs could be addressed and how we can share with each other globally. For that, the website is already up. It's on museums, plural, ONMUSEUMS, on museums, one word.com. And you'll find all the documentation from ICOM Austria too. How best museums can better improve the 4 pillars of cultural, economic, social, environmental sustainability through the implementation of UN SDGs and Agenda 2030. Thank you.
The new definition of museum after Prague ICOM Assembly put the thematic of inclusion and decolonization inside the mission of museum institution. How do you think will be the future of museum?
Well, ICOM definition has been contentious. We ended up in a fiasco in Kyoto, but finally in Prague, August last year, the new definition was adopted. And it does mention inclusion and decolonization. We could have gone further, but then getting, so many members opinion of 50,000 members from so many countries, so many committees together is a huge challenge. And I think that the leadership of ICOM has done a great job furthering the definition of the museum. However, decolonization needs to be central and it needs to be embedded in the ethics of ICOM that are currently under revision, so also inclusion. But these two need to be not top down but bottom up. Top down approach to decolonization and inclusion in museums doesn't really help. It doesn't change anything. And there are many museums which will only open up if governments give them special grants for exhibitions. And that shouldn't be the approach. And it should be the approach where the respective museum, through its strategic planning process, becomes responsive to its culturally and linguistically diverse stakeholders and becomes relevant through its strategic planning. It's becoming relevant, it's being reflective, it's being confronting of the limitations of the existing practice of museology. And so I think the future of museums and exhibitory practices in practice need to be through participatory cultural mapping of the values, cultural values, heritage values of stakeholders, connecting collections, communities, and within their contextuality, and the triangulation of that, the triangulation of Black Lives Matter as a thematic everywhere in the world, the addressing of climate crisis, addressing of what happened during the pandemic was the rich museums survived, many small museums closed, and who has actually cared about the small museums that closed? And yet the majority of museums in the world are small museums. Rich museums have gone back to their old ways. And I think that museums need to really rethink, based on the new definition of ICOM, what it means to be inclusive with an open mind rather than thinking that they already know. Decolonize their mentality. It's not about just collections, it's about psychological decolonization that's so critical. And move forward through demonstration projects, through collaborations, and move it into exciting world that is out there. And I want to finish with the example of one country which had I won't mention the name of the country. It spent a lot of money on this idea of inclusion and decolonization. And it had nearly 32 museums participating, which were all funded. By the end of it, it just didn't deliver because the idea they took was that we in museums have the collections. You are the people from outside. Come and tell us how we should work with you. It should have been the other way around. As Dr. Lonnie Bunch said, it's not about museums being community centered, but museums being part of the communities. And I think only when we decolonize our institutions, only when we understand the genuine meaning of inclusion, that is all of us, that we would move forward. And when Mandela became the president of Free Democratic South Africa, he, giving on the 10th of May 1994, his inaugural address, he said South Africa is for all South Africans, by which he meant that South Africa is not about white people, black people, colored people, Asian people, or indigenous people. It's all of us. It has to be equitable for everybody. That is the ethic based on which the International Research Network on the Inclusive Museum was founded. And I hope to see most of the people who really care about inclusion and decolonization coming to Vienna in September 2024. And I'll repeat, the website is On Museums, one word, onmuseums.com. The whole framework, the scope and concerns are there. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts today and the well-framed questions. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Nana. Hope you're listening. And somewhere, wherever you are. Thank you, Madalena. And thank you to ICAMT.
On behalf of the ICAMT board, thank you, Amareswar, for this very interesting conversation, and also my personal thanks. Goodbye, thank you for listening. See you soon in the next ICAM podcast episode.